In the spring of 1558, something happened inside the Tower of London that the executioners could not explain. A woman named Margaret Clitheroe was stretched on the rack for over 15 hours, and when it was finally over, it wasn't her body that shattered, it was the machine itself. The same device that had terrorized England for decades, the same instrument that had extracted confessions from hundreds of prisoners, simply broke apart under forces it was never designed to withstand. But this story doesn't begin with Margaret's triumph. It begins years earlier, in the darkest chambers of Tudor England, where men in positions of power sat down with anatomical charts and engineering blueprints to design something truly monstrous. They asked themselves a question that should never have been asked. How can we modify this torture device to specifically target the female body? The year was 1540, and Master Engineer Thomas Norton was presenting King Henry VIII with detailed schematics that would make even hardened historians turn away. These weren't simple torture implements. They were the result of consultations with court physicians, men who understood anatomy and used that knowledge not to heal but to destroy. Norton had identified something the Crown found valuable. Women's bodies were structurally different from men's, and those differences could be weaponized. The wider pelvic structure, the lower center of gravity, the way joints connected differently around childbearing organs. Every biological distinction became a target. Norton's enhanced rack featured adjustable anchor points designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. When stretched, a woman's hip joints would dislocate in patterns that caused damage far beyond what male prisoners experienced. But the true horror wasn't just physical. Norton introduced what he called the birthing position restraint, deliberately positioning victims in the same vulnerable posture they would assume during childbirth. Every woman who witnessed this understood the message. Even your most sacred biological function can be turned into a weapon against you. What your history books never told you was that this wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic, calculated, and documented with clinical precision. Norton's notes described female anatomy with the detachment of a butcher examining cuts of meat, noting which angles produced the most psychological devastation alongside the physical trauma. And he wasn't working alone. Behind him stood an entire apparatus of educated men, physicians and engineers and interrogators, all contributing their expertise to perfect the art of gender-specific torture. The rack became more than an instrument of confession, became a monument to patriarchal control, a machine that declared to every woman in England, your body is not your own, and if you forget your place, we know exactly how to remind you. And Askew learned this in 1546 when her shoulder blade tore away from its socket with a sound that echoed through stone chambers. But she was only the beginning. What came next would prove that even the most perfectly designed system of cruelty has a weakness it cannot account for: the human will to resist. By 1557, something unexpected was happening in the torture chambers beneath the Tower of London. Women were transforming their suffering into something their captors never anticipated. Testimony: Rose Allen, stretched on the rack for her Protestant faith, began preaching instead of screaming. Her voice, amplified by the stone acoustics, carried her words beyond the prison walls to crowds gathered outside. She wasn't begging for mercy, she was delivering sermons while her joints dislocated, turning her torture session into a public performance that exposed her torturer's brutality rather than her own weakness. Joyce Lewis took this resistance even further, narrating her torture in real time. "Now they tightened the rope on my left ankle," she would announce calmly. "Now they apply pressure to dislocate my shoulder." The psychological effect on the executioners was devastating. These men had operated in secrecy, their cruelty hidden behind thick walls. Suddenly their victims were making them famous, and not in the way they intended. If you're still watching this, you understand that the darkest chapters of history hold lessons we desperately need to remember. Make sure you're subscribed, because stories like these aren't just about the past. They're about recognizing patterns of systematic oppression that still exist today. Understanding how entire societies convince themselves that targeted cruelty is acceptable, even necessary. These women turned their suffering into the most effective propaganda campaign Tudor England had ever seen, and their courage deserves to be remembered. But nothing prepared the Tower authorities for Margaret Clitheroe. At 43, older than most torture victims and bearing the physical evidence of motherhood, the executioners assumed she would break quickly when they strapped her to the rack in March of 1558. They were catastrophically wrong. Chief Executioner William Hartwell documented what happened that night in increasingly frantic hourly reports. By hour 3, Margaret was analyzing her torture as it occurred, offering technical critiques of the rack's operation. "Your rope tension is uneven," she told her torturers. "The left pulley mechanism needs adjustment." By hour 7, she was explaining why their psychological intimidation tactics weren't working. Her unusual resistance to pain meant the executioners kept increasing tension far beyond normal levels, pushing the machine into territory it was never designed to handle. Margaret's body, instead of breaking quickly like other victims, maintained structural integrity while absorbing unprecedented forces. Around hour 10, the impossible began to happen. The rack itself started to fail. Hartwell's final report, written in shaky handwriting, describes a machine coming apart under tension it couldn't withstand. "The device appears to be failing before the subject," he wrote. "This has never occurred in recorded history." At exactly 15 hours and 37 minutes, the tower's main rack suffered catastrophic structural failure. The wooden beam split down the middle with a crack heard across the Thames. Margaret Clitheroe died not from her injuries but from exhaustion, having outlasted the machine designed to break her. Her last recorded words were delivered to a witnessing priest. "I have learned much about the weakness of those who mistake cruelty for strength." Within 6 months, Henry VIII ordered the rack's removal from regular use. The official reason cited mechanical unreliability, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying to those in power. Margaret had exposed the ultimate weakness of systematic torture. It only works when victims believe their torturers are stronger than they are. The rack that had terrorized Tudor England for decades was finally defeated not by political pressure or moral arguments, but by one woman's refusal to break before the machine that was supposed to be unbreakable. Her victory revealed something authoritarian systems desperately want us to forget. Systematic cruelty is ultimately self-defeating when it encounters people who refuse to be intimidated by it. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Tudor society to justify gender-specific torture are still operating in conflicts worldwide today. From wartime atrocities to modern systems of oppression, understanding how these patterns work is the first step in recognizing and stopping them. Margaret's story proves that true strength isn't about avoiding pain. It's about refusing to let that pain define your worth or destroy your spirit.